Hi, I'm Sarah Ozel-Shore. I am a psychotherapist and clinical trainer. And over the next coming months, May, June, August, and September of 2026, I will be offering a free clinical training entitled Why Good Interventions Fail Assessing Regulation in Real Time. This webinar introduces the concept of regulation, client nervous system regulation in session as requisite for any clinical work that you will engage in with the client during said session. So, this is not about modality and it is not about technique. It is about assessing what the client is capable of integrating during any given session. In my framework, and I go into more detail about this in the training, is based on the idea that there are certain capacities that are either present or absent in any given session, and that really determines what kind of therapeutic and clinical work is possible with that client in that moment. So, for this particular webinar, we talk about the concept of regulation, the capacity of regulation. Is your client regulated in your current session, in this very moment that you're meeting with your client? So, we talk about how to assess for regulation, what becomes possible if the client is in a regulated state, and what becomes necessary if the client is in a state of dysregulation. Now, a lot of us are familiar with a lot of us are familiar with obvious signs of dysregulation, especially when they fall toward the hyper aroused end of the spectrum. So, a client that is dysregulated, toward that end of the spectrum will look flooded, will have pressured speech, maybe fidgety or unable to really sit still, isn't really making relational contact with you, etc. Most therapists are really good at noticing that, right? And so when your client is dysregulated, we have to re-regulate them. That's the only work that's actually possible in the session if you are sitting across from a client that's dysregulated or becomes dysregulated during your session. Re-regulate. So how do you do that? And that's really all about synchrony between you and the client, so that we start working in a window where things become tolerable, where reflection can happen now, and where perhaps insight and deeper work can develop. However, there's another side of the spectrum when your client is dysregulated, and that's when it falls more toward the hypoactivated state. So, this is a client that's really approaching more of a dorsal collapse or shutdown in session. They are not regulated, even though he or she appears calm. So, this is a client that might still be verbal, but you don't notice that the client is really connecting with you, that there's relational contact between you and your client. Your client may be making eye contact, maybe showing nonverbal behaviors that signal to you calm attentiveness. But perhaps you're noticing a blankness, or perhaps you're noticing that your client it feels like it's going through the motions. There doesn't seem to be a meeting of the minds, a therapeutic connection happening in the moment. That is also dysregulation, but it often goes missed or unaddressed. And so This upcoming clinical training that I'm offering a few times over the next few months, called Why Good Interventions Fail, Assessing Regulation in Real Time, is really about drilling down into what are we observing that tells us whether our client is regulated or not. What are signs that we might miss if the client is moving toward more of a dysregulation that is shut down as opposed to activated? And then how do we work with the client to bring regulation back into the session? Because when your client is dysregulated, whether toward the hypo or hyper end of the spectrum, the only work that becomes possible in the session is to re-regulate them. And that is an effective session. So these are some things that we'll be talking about in the webinar. And if any of this resonates with you, I would love to have you join us. I'm Sarah Ozel Shore, and I'll see you next time.